So we've gone over each GE type, but we still need to talk about the generated gated gate types. So when we choose the generated gated option, you see that this gate type option becomes available. The first one on the list is VEL, which stands for velocity. It's probably easier for me to explain these first two as kind of a group. When it designates vel in the beginning of the name, it just means that the velocity group is controlling velocity. So each note event that Karma generates is going to play those notes based with a velocity that's based on this pattern here in this velocity group. So you can see we have a high velocity event and then kind of like a little lower one and then a higher one and then a little lower one. And you can see that this is a high velocity event and then a little bit lower and then a high velocity event and then a little bit lower. I guess I should say that it's technically playing a velocity of 127 here and then of 64 because this curve actually weights this. When you see a kind of a column like this, it's usually a randomization factor inside of Karma, and I'm kind of getting like we're getting way ahead of ourselves by talking about this, but again, it's hard to not talk about this while explaining the differences between the generated gated types. But know that later on I will review this and we will go into that in detail. So the velocity, basically just know now that this pattern is only affecting velocity. The next one, velocity CP, all that means is that the cluster pattern is now enabled. So if I'm down at with just velocity, it's disabled, but velocity CP means the cluster pattern grid is enabled. And we'll get into more details of the cluster pattern when we get to it. But then the next four are different from the first two. So you see that says CC. What this means is that the velocity group, the velocity pattern, is now affecting a CC instead of affecting velocity. And now the notes are sustaining instead of triggering per rhythm event. So if I hold a note, see that it's sustained. That's what this line means. This outstretched line means how long the notes were sustained for. So this grid is now patched into CC11, which happens to be a volume control. So it really doesn't sound that much different from, the way it was sounding when it was affecting velocity. But I could patch this into whatever else I want. I think the low pass filter cutoff would be a good example. So now this pattern grid is affecting the position of our cutoff knob. Now we don't hear anything right now because there's not enough movement in the cutoff to hear anything. I can move this slider though, which will affect the scale of these events. At 100%, it just means that this has the cutoff knob at its position that it was programmed at, but then it's moving it in a negative direction now to minus 64, so we probably will hear that. Yeah, it's slight. Let's increase it though. So you can really hear how the cutoff is a lot lower for these low velocity events. What I can do if I wanted to, remember this stacked column is a kind of randomization element. I can increase this factor here and I could put it at just 0. And that means there's equally as much of a chance of it playing a high event versus a low event. And in this case, it would make a high cutoff versus a low cutoff. So now when I hold a chord, we almost get kind of like a sample and hold type effect, at least for the first phase. When we get into phase 2, we see that our weighted curve will be back, so it's always going to be playing the lowest cutoff point. And then the other factor of this is not just that the velocity pattern is affecting a CC, it's now going to re-trigger the notes based on phase transposition. So right now with no transposition in the phases, I will not re-trigger the notes at all. I can hold it down for as long as I want. It's not going to re-trigger. So I held it down this whole time, no retriggering. But if I have some transposition going on in phase 2, you can see which phase we're on, by the way, by looking at these two lights. So I'll just point it out with the mouse and hold it down. So in phase 2, there's a transposition, and there was a retriggering of notes. And in fact, I held it for so long that it went back into phase 1, and since phase 1 has a different transposition from phase 2, it does retrigger the notes when we get back into phase 1. So then the next one on the list is that it sustains the notes, but it retriggers when entering phase 1, and that's even without any transposition going on. So now we're in phase 2, no retriggering, but then phase 1, we did get a retrigger again. By the way, if there is a transposition, it does still retrigger the notes. It's not like it does like a pitch bend or anything. It will still retrigger the notes. In fact, it has to for the transposition to like take effect, since it's a MIDI note event, not like a pitch bend data effect. And also note that transposition doesn't have to be like for every phase 2. I can make it just for like this phase 2 in this grid here. And we're kind of getting way ahead of ourselves. Again, I'll review all this stuff when we're actually talking about the phase group. But if I click this button and then I click this grid, I can go to the second phase event, and then I can turn that up and then hit enter. And now with now with phase 2, just for this spot at a transposition, it will still retrigger when entering phase 2 because of the transposition, and then it will also retrigger for phase 1 right there, but then not this time. See that there was no retriggering there, but then for phase 1, it did retrigger the notes again. And the consequences of that right now don't matter, because this patch doesn't have some kind of like long sweeping envelope or something where retriggering the notes would create an effect that would be apparent. But when you are doing complex sound design, you know, that definitely matters. Note on events absolutely matter. So I'm just going to reset this, X this out. I'm also going to disable the transpose button. So the next one on the list is sustain notes but retrigger when entering phase 2. That should be obvious. Retrigger. There it is. Don't retrigger. But you can tell we are back in phase 1 because we're getting kind of that sample and hold effect. And then, last but not least, we have sustain notes and retrigger when entering any phase. It's abbreviated CCA. Yep. Cool. So just to recap, the first two mean that the velocity grid is actually just changing velocity, and that we're getting a bunch of retriggering notes. Oh, let me change it to velocity. We're getting a bunch of retriggering notes. And actually, you notice, by the way, since I did change the behavior of this grid, that is reflected right now. It's almost like we have a sample and hold effect on velocity now. But anyway, first two are velocity. This grid is affecting velocity. Last four mean that this grid is now affecting a CC of your choice. But then it's also retriggering the notes, or it's sustaining the notes and only retriggering them depending on transpositions or phase. So it's pretty straightforward. I'll talk about those again undoubtedly while we go through the phase group. Yeah, so now let's move on to series. It's gonna be a lot. It's gonna start to smooth out. It's gonna get a lot easier from here on out.